I'd like to welcome everyone to Salado United Methodist Church in Salado, Texas, essentially halfway between Austin and Waco. I'd like to welcome you if you have accidentally stumbled upon this Bible study. We are talking about the Gospel of Mark, and the last time we got together, I tried to set the context of this particular text, which is Mark 14:27 through 42. Jesus and the disciples have just gotten done with the Passover meal or the Seder meal, that which is led directly into Christian Lord's Supper or Last Supper or Eucharist. And this particular supper, after the supper, Jesus takes the disciples with him. They sing a hymn and they go out to the Mount of Olives. So I would like to begin there, and I'd like to do a fairly careful look at the text. I generally prefer the New Revised Standard Version of translation of the Bible, but one of my superiors has insisted that we use the Common English Version, which I don't think is as strong as the NRSV, but since these texts will be used to write Sunday school lessons for the whole United Methodist Church, I am going to defer to their wishes, and we will be using the CEB. So, after they've sung the hymn and they get to the Garden of the Mount of Olives, really, Jesus said to them, and this is to all 11 disciples. Judas has, begged to be excused from the table, and he leaves. And the reason for his leaving the table, of course, he didn't say so at the time, but he was to betray Jesus for money. And he's not the first to do that, I'm sure. Neither was he the last. So Jesus says to these other disciples who are still with him at this point, "You will all falter in your faithfulness to me." So what Jesus basically tells the ones that are still with him after the Seder meal is that they're all going to fall away. They're all going to abandon him and desert him. And of course, this must be very, very shocking to the disciples who see themselves as very faithful people. And then Jesus continues, "As it is written," and he quotes from the prophecy of Zechariah here. "I will hit the shepherd, and the sheep will go off in all directions." Jesus, quoting this prophecy, is talking about how he, as the shepherd, will be struck or hit, and all the sheep who are following the shepherd, which in this case would be the disciples, they will go off in all directions. In other words, scattered to the four winds. As you probably know, the shepherd is a figure of speech or an analogy or a symbol for the monarchy in Israel. When the monarchy started with Saul and David and Solomon, and then went to Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and then on to a bunch of other lesser lights, they were understood as shepherds of the people of Israel. And one thing to know is that the word Messiah is also used of these particular kings. And so in the history of theology, especially in the latter part of the putting together of the Hebrew Bible, the idea is that shepherd and Messiah almost merge into one sort of, I guess you would say, symbol. And so when Jesus says the shepherd will be struck, he's talking about himself. And when he says the sheep will go off in all directions, they'll be scattered, he is talking about the disciples. But after I am raised, this is Jesus speaking, I will go before you to Galilee. Now, we remember from the early parts of the Gospel of Mark that Galilee was a place from where almost all of the disciples, and perhaps all of them, were from. They lived in the very northern part of Israel, which would have been the region of Galilee. It's almost all the way to Syria as you go north. It's north and east of what is today called Haifa. It's right near Capernaum, very close, right on the Sea of Galilee. And this is the place of origin of all the disciples. Well, over about 3 years, Jesus and the disciples preaching, doing miracles, healing people, feeding people. They trickle down from Galilee until they get to Jerusalem. And that's when they enter Jerusalem at Mark 11. Mark 11 through Mark 15 is the part of Mark's gospel that deals with the ministry in and around Jerusalem. But before that, they went to various places. They went to, like say, Jericho, for instance, where they healed a man who was blind. And so Jesus says, after I am raised up, which would raise red flags for most people if they heard it for the first time. But in chapters 8, 9, and 10, Jesus has already predicted what is going to happen to him, but it just seems like the disciples are not paying attention. And so Jesus says, once I am raised up, that is after death, when he is raised up, resurrected by God, in fact, I will go before you to Galilee. And so in a way, Jesus completes the loop. And so from where they started the Gospel's ministry of the kingdom of God, they will also finish what Jesus started. He will meet them in Galilee, and they will begin anew in Galilee with the gospel message. But when Jesus says this, Peter said to him, even if everyone else stumbles, I won't. We remember Peter. Peter was very adept at blurting things out and always saying things without really thinking them through. These words Peter will soon eat within the next 12 hours, perhaps. He says, even if everyone else stumbles, I won't. And that word stumbles is from the Greek word scandalon, which is the word that we get for scandal. It means to trip somebody up. It's sort of like a speed bump that has to do with normal human reactions. Jesus says it would have been better if someone would not have been born rather than to throw this scandal or this thing to stumble over in front of these little children. So it's a very high-powered word, and so when Peter uses it, he just heightens the ridiculousness of what he's saying. Even if everyone else stumbles, I won't. And of course, Peter, like Mark does in several places, has one disciple speak for all, because they're all of one voice and one perspective, it looks like. At one point, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, asked Jesus if they can sit at his right and his left hand when Jesus comes into glory. And Jesus says, that is not for me to grant, for you to sit at my right or my left hand. It is for those for whom it has been prepared. And then later, just a sentence or two later, Jesus says, can you drink the cup that I drink? Which basically means the cup of suffering. And of course, they say, yes, we are able. And that's where our hymn comes from, are ye able? But then Jesus says, after he says, if everyone else stumbles, I won't. Jesus said to Peter, I assure you that on this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Now, I don't know how you can get much more specific than that. 2 cock crows, 3 denials. I mean, that's pretty specific. And of course, I'm sure it hurt Peter's feelings because Peter sees himself as the most faithful of all of the disciples. And so Peter insists, if I must die alongside you, I will not deny you. And as I said a moment ago, Peter speaks for all of the disciples, and they all, that is, all the disciples, said the same thing. So they were all very assured that they would be by Jesus to the very end, which, of course, we know they were not. Next thing that happens is that Jesus and the disciples come to a place called Gethsemane. And the word Gethsemane basically means olive press. And what an olive press is something that you place a bunch of olives in, and then you just press it down and smash it until the oil oozes out, and that's how they get olive oil. And in a way, Jesus is saying, the circumstances that are surrounding me now in this hour are pressing in on me, and I am feeling great pressure, which is happening. So Jesus says to them, after they come to Gethsemane, he says to all the disciples that are still with him, sit here while I pray. And then he takes the inner circle of 3, Peter, James, and John, along with him. Every now and then you will see that there are 4 disciples that are chosen, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. But in this case, it's just the top 3. He began to feel despair and was anxious. That is, Jesus felt despair and was anxious. And I want to point out here that I do not remember any other places in the gospel where it so explicitly shows us that Jesus was beginning to crack under the pressure of the circumstance that he was in. He was feeling despair. He was feeling anxious. Those are all 2 human emotions. And generally speaking, we don't see any of the gospel writers writing about Jesus in this particular way. And what Mark, I think, is trying to help us understand is that Jesus was not only God, but Jesus was also a human being. Later, by about 4 centuries, comes into play this idea of the doctrine or the dogma of the incarnation, which basically means that Jesus is fully divine and fully human, and that is a mystery beyond which we cannot explain any further. We know that it's true, we believe that it's true, we think it's true, but in order to understand how to explain it, human beings cannot do that. And then Jesus continues to talk to these 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John. I am very sad. It's as if I'm dying, which, as a matter of fact, he was. Stay here and keep alert. Over and over in the Gospel of Mark, we see this business about watch, wait, pay attention, look alive, get tuned in, stay here and keep alert. But obviously the disciples do not listen to Jesus at the depths with which he should have been listened to. Then he went a short distance farther, and he fell to the ground. Jesus prayed that if it's possible, he might be spared the time of suffering. That is, he didn't want to drink the cup of suffering that James and John had said they would be able to do. And then Jesus prayed, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Take this cup of suffering away from me. This is a very human prayer. Sometimes when we find ourselves in adverse situations. We pray that this situation might resolve itself and get us out of this terrible mess that someone else has put us in or we put ourselves in. But then he says, however, not what I want, but what you want. This is a very important prayer that Jesus makes because he does it 3 times. Abba, Father, for you, all things are possible. Take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not what I want, but what you want. And after Jesus prays this prayer for an hour, he came and found Peter, James, and John, and they are all sleeping. And he says to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? And I think the notice here is that instead of calling him Peter like he does throughout most of the gospel, he reverts back to Simon's given name, which is Simon. And he asks him if he's asleep. Then he asks him, couldn't you stay alert or awake for 1 hour? Stay alert and pray so that you won't give in to temptation. The spirit is eager. In other words, his profession of faith, he's eager about that. But the flesh is weak. Living up to that profession is a very difficult thing. So then Jesus goes back to prayer again. He left them and then he repeats the same words of the prayer. Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not what I want, but what you want. After another hour of prayer in that direction, Jesus comes back and he finds the disciples sleeping again, for they couldn't keep their eyes open. Kind of like being at church. And they didn't know how to respond to Jesus. So then he comes the 3rd time and he says to them, will you sleep and rest all night? That's enough. The time has come for the human one or the Son of Man or the Messiah. Any of those things can be substituted there for this phrase, the human one, to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go, look, here comes my betrayer. And of course we all know that the betrayer is Judas, and Judas comes and betrays or gives Jesus away by giving him a kiss on the cheek. And that's the end of our lesson for today. But Mark's point is, disciples then, as disciples now, can make a big, bold confession of faith. But the truth of the matter is, it's a lot easier to talk than it is to act. Words may mean something, but actions mean more. And the disciples had a strong start in their discipleship with Jesus. But as we go through the Gospel of Mark, there's one great disappointment after another, and it's all brought about because the disciples have an agenda. It just doesn't happen to be the agenda that is Jesus' agenda, which in the big picture is God's agenda. If you want to read ahead, look at Mark 16. We will pick up next week with Mark 16, and I thank you for being with me today.